Will the world follow the US down or up? To borrow a quote from US President Donald Trump. On January the 27th, the United States will officially withdraw from the Paris Agreement for a second time. This process began a year ago when US President Donald Trump signed an executive order announcing the country's exit from the organization. In fact, he also signed an executive order earlier this month announcing America's withdrawal from 66 international organizations, including 31 UN organizations. It seems the US is pulling back from the world stage, and yet at the same time, it has taken actions with an expansionist touch. The capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, threatening military strikes in Iran, eyeing Greenland, just to name a few. How to make sense of these seemingly contradictory behaviors? How consequential will these actions be? And how should other countries adapt and respond? Welcome to The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Shanghai by University Professor Huang Jing at Shanghai International Studies University. From Beijing by Zoon Ahmed Khan, Pakistani researcher and journalist at the Center for China and Globalization, a prominent think tank. And from Shanghai also by Professor Joseph Mahoney, East China Normal University. Welcome to the three of you. First of all, for those who haven't been following the stories up close, here is a very brief take of what I meant by the contrast between withdrawal and expansion. For instance, in 2025, President Trump, after returning to the White House, announced that he would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement for a second time and from the World Health Organization. The latter will leave $278 million unpaid contribution, which the institution has highlighted while commenting on the United States withdrawal. Then President Trump, as I said, directed the United States to withdraw from 66 international organizations, including UN organizations and other ones. In terms of the opposite direction, we saw from January 2025 to January 2026, the US conducted 573 air and drone strikes around the world, compared with 494 strikes during President Biden's 4-year term. So in 1 year versus 4 year. And similarly, the United States was involved in 1,008 foreign military events in at least 9 countries in 1 year, resulting in an estimated 1,090 fatalities, compared with, for a 4-year period of time, 1,500 deaths from 1,600 events under President Joe Biden. So let me go to Professor Huang Jing first. Help us understand these seemingly contradictory behaviors. What exactly is going on there? Am I comparing oranges with apples?
Yes, I think Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and he has no regard about international rules or norms and principles. Also, sense means nothing to him. All his behavior is according to his own interests. Giving his recent speech at Davos, it's really an embarrassment to me to watch him speaking at the world stage the way like that. But all those kind of use of force, in my view, is not a show of strength, but rather it's a show of weakness, because a great power like United States will have to so easily, so irresponsibly use force against others, especially the weak parties. It's amazing. But his behavior actually had two sides. On one side, like my good friend Ian Bremer said, he's very taco. When he deals with China, Russia, he's a president of taco. But when he deals with
always chicken out.
Yeah, chicken out. Always chicken out. And when he deals with weak parties or weak countries like Venezuela and Greenland or Denmark, what I'm trying to say is that this is a person who does not have any morality, has not any rules or values whatsoever. He's always self-centered and all self-interests. And I think it's such a damage he has done so far to America, to Americanism, and to international order. and to all the principles that we human beings used to uphold there. And some damage are irreparable. And in that regard, I would say that the kind of withdrawal from WHO, from the Paris Agreement, all of this to us is kind of shock. It's surprise, but to him, that's quite normal because that's kind of person he really is.
So, very briefly, how would you describe his global strategy if he has one?
In his term, he's back into Monroe doctrine, but I would say that if I have to use something, I have to say he's back to Jacksonianism in a kind of worst part. Because we know that ever since World War II, United States foreign policy and also internal policy is very much guided by so-called Wilson internationalism or Wilson liberal internationalism. But Jacksonism comes from President Andrew Jackson, who was elected 1826. He basically institutionalized Monroe Doctrine on one hand, and on the other hand, he put America first. He put a high tariff, the act so-called the Reinforced Tax Tariff Act, and also he put white man first and established so-called Jacksonianism. That is what the books are trying to to say who he really is. But to me, he's a very conservative and also very self-centered. Actually, American first is come from Andrew Jackson, and also, of course, he's also put so-called isolationism from him. So from 1826 roughly all the way until 1900, American politics and foreign policy is actually guided by Jacksonianism. And now Donald Trump obviously is returned to that kind of approach internally and externally.
Zoon, let me come to you. How do you see this from your perspective? Do you see a coherent strategy, or is it really today I think I do this, tomorrow I do that, totally disorganized, but always in the spotlight?
I think I, to a great extent, also agree with Professor Huang's analysis of the situation. But Trump's strategy seems to be somewhat coherent and maybe also predictable in a world where the international institutions, the UN-centered system, the international order per se, has recognized that the global south, China's rise, the emerging, parts of the world need to be more central and more, core. Their interests, their perspectives, their demands, their requirements need to be a more central part of, their execution plans. And in that, maybe what the United States and even those who talk about the so-called, rules-based order, they forget that the international order is not status quo. It is, in fact, these legal principles, the legal, the laws, the principles, as Professor Huang also mentioned, which treat all countries as equal. No country should be above the international law. So what the United States seems to be doing right now is to challenge the international legal order itself by exiting it, by so to speak, by declaring it to be biased, to be against, to be either irrelevant, or to toe the lines of the so-called, repressive countries or revisionist powers. But actually, the vast majority of the world, and also if you see China's strategy right now, it is to also showcase that we all collectively need to strengthen and to support the international law that all countries have signed up to. And this also means better representation. We know that the Global Governance Initiative was also recently announced as a recognition of how these institutions need to evolve to represent better. And in that, the United States sees its own power diminishing, its own unilateral, ability to declare what's correct and what's not, to be diminishing and to be holding less credibility. So I think actually Trump's strategy, where you say on the one hand, he seems to be withdrawing from international institutions, and on the other hand, he seems to be, conducting whatever happened in Venezuela, Iran. It's all to move back towards a system where the status quo powers, the hegemon, so to speak, can move forward unchecked. And now the real question I think in front of us is to what extent other parts of the world. We just saw at Davos, for instance, the Canadian Prime Minister, even the European Union, I think they all recognize that such unchecked power is damaging to everyone. It can be, nobody is fully protected from this. And what we really need is more institutionalism, is, to collectively strengthen the laws that we have all agreed upon. So I think what Trump is really trying to do is to regain a sense of autonomy, to regain
supremacy, maybe?
That he's also relatively pragmatic in the sense that it's also economic, but it's coercive at the end. And this is what any power would do if it sees itself losing control and if it is being made to share power and it loses that, that status it has had for decades of the sole hegemony.
I see. Joseph, your take on what the Trump strategy is, and is it going to be very much consequential, or is it going to be a temporary disruption where things will slowly get back to a different kind of balance, a couple of years down the line?
Well, there are a number of points here. First, to go back to the numbers you were giving us comparing Biden's impressions with those associated with Trump, I agree that Trump's numbers are awful and they ought to be condemned. But we also need to keep in mind that Biden was responsible for proxy wars being waged with American support that also left a lot of people dead. So I think we would have to inflate the numbers of both men's administrations. Now, with regard to the strategy, I think that we can speculate that there are at least three key elements that absolutely have to be mentioned. The first is, of course, that the U.S. national security document asserts exclusive hegemonic privilege over the Western Hemisphere, the so-called Monroe Doctrine, or the Trump corollary, and has already, as we know, aggressed against many nations there. Second, with Trump's attacks on others, economically and militarily, along with his so-called peace board, we see a new attempt to reestablish a imperial model. In fact, he's demonstrated that he's opposed to multilateralism and international law. The peace board might ultimately be little more than a global mafioso protection racket, one that will, require membership fees to participate in a mechanism that in turn protects them from U.S. aggression, whether that U.S. aggression takes the form of rent-seeking, neo-mercantilist trade policies, currency manipulations, or outright military attacks. So, I think what we're starting to worry is that the peace board seeks to supplant the UN and the UNSC by creating a new commission, to refer to an old mafioso term in the United States, headed by a boss of bosses who has veto power over all others, who can serve in perpetuity, who can appoint his own successor. And so this is pure imperialism. Now, third, the golden thread, it seems, is opposition to China and all that China represents, including multilateralism, national rejuvenation, win-win development, fighting climate change, supporting socialism, and so on. Now, with regard to what all this forebodes, I think it's clear that the U.S. is repositioning strategically to reestablish mechanisms of hegemony, above all because the U.S. system, which is beset with systemic risks at home and abroad, depends on hegemony to sustain itself and indeed avoid a precipice of even steeper declines. Now, with regard to its strategy, I think to answer your question, we should understand that this is something that's happening in China, what we call a new era, but also an era where we have a number of intersecting singularities. And whether or not we're reaching sort of a cascade point, a tipping point, a rupture, what Foucault would represent as a rupture, or Polanyi, a great transformation, it's really difficult for us to project what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. We know that the U.S. seems to be preparing for a possible war. We know that we have a number of intersecting issues like climate change, like paradigm shifting technologies, all coming in at the same time. So in the midst of all of this, it's difficult to say.
Well, the reason why we do shows like this is to provide more clarity, or find more clarity, even just for myself. And I'm using this opportunity to really try to find some answers. Professor Huang, for instance, let's say the remainder of President Trump's second term in office. How would you describe the world we're living in? the previous 80 years, we had a relative stable balance with, the institutions that the U.S. helped set up. And now that Trump has discredited all of that and tried to, start a new commission with the border peace, maybe that's just the first step. What are we stepping into?
I think we have two points I want to make. First is that obviously we see the rise of Global South. What Global South, of course, is not an organization, not even a kind of institution, not that at all. But globalization we put together is that number one, they all have a very strong opposition against any behavior like imperialism, just Professor Mahoney mentioned, because all of them have suffered from colonialism, imperialism. They have a very bitter memory about this. A second, they also want a kind of development. A third, they want equal participation, equal rights, equal participation in global affairs. Of course, they want multilateralism. And that's first. And about the rise of Global South can also be seen like in today's world, all the so-called world power that is considered a great power in the world, except United States in the West. All of the rest is Brazil, China, India, Russia, all of them in Global South. And this is, in my view, a fundamental change because after industrialization, all the so-called global powers are around Atlantic. But nowadays, the Atlantic is no longer a center for global politics. What worries me most is this great division and uncertainty in the United States and the 3 years. We say that United States is declining. That's no question about that. But what worries me most is if with Donald Trump in the leadership, we could see a disorderly decline. That'd be enormously dangerous, not just for the United States, but for all of us.
Well, very interesting points. Let me ask you the first one. Are the Global South countries, okay, collectively, we are very powerful, but individually, we're still very weak. That's why, a lot of countries are very careful when it comes to dealing with a superpower, with an imperialist power such as the United States, because they know alone they don't have the bargaining power. Either they will have to be taught a lesson in a hard way, or they're just going to shut up and bear with it. Professor Huang, how do you look at the near-term?
I beg to disagree. I don't think Global South is kind of take whatever Donald Trump or
individual
United
countries.
States gives them. I give you 3 examples. First, let me say, when I look at Davos, I feel a little bit pity because all those global North countries are fighting like a cat and dogs there. But the majority, so-called silent majority, Global South is no longer there. But the point is that when Donald Trump, launched the so-called tariff war against everybody, including those small islands, it is China and the India who has been standing firm, who actually roll back Donald Trump's tariff war. And another example is that when Donald Trump, under his leadership, United States used military actions to kidnap, not capture, kidnap the President Maduro and his wife. And all those countries in Latin America are standing firm. 5 countries plus Spain issued very strong condemnation, like Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and the other 5 countries. And they unanimously, except of course Argentina, condemn it. And also when United States under Donald Trump tried to grab oil from Venezuela, and those countries stand firm. And as a matter of fact, you cannot just take oil out of Venezuela. You need to investment. On the one hand, we say that none of the major oil companies want to invest in there. And number 2, we do not say United States has taken any action to, for example, wipe out China's investment over there, almost $966 million over there. China sent a special envoys there. I don't think it's the miscalculation. When China sending special envoys, because China knows the situation there is getting worse. That's why special envoy goes there to reinforce China's presence in that country. And so far, he's still there. We did not say any action. Donald Trump has taken any action to kind of wipe out or take away China's investment. Because Chinese leadership understand if China cannot hold its ground in Venezuela, all the China's investment in Latin America could be in danger. That's how stand strong. And Global South did not have much voice in today's global discourse. Does not mean they're weak. They're not weak. Look at India. Look at Latin American countries. Look at Middle East. All those countries actually stand very firm. When we say like what happened in Davos, that's only part of the world, even though they have much louder voice.
Okay.
But that doesn't matter.
Okay. Let me go to Zoon. Zoon, this is a very important question that Professor Huang mentioned. In Davos, you see, the bickering back and forth, but these are all global North countries. What is the global South potentially facing? What are they talking about at this moment as we go forward?
Well, I think first of all, as both of the other panelists also mentioned, the global South is an emerging reality. We are no longer talking about a silent majority. We're talking about a majority that has very pragmatic, practical interests, challenges that we face, developmental issues. And then, for the global South right now, I do not believe the global South is a monolith. I do not believe it's as united collectively as it should be. But altogether, our requirements, our demands, our expectations from the system, from global powers are assuming center stage. That said, I think what the global South really wants right now is obviously better institutions, more multilateralism. We are looking for practical solutions. We are looking for global powers that can address the challenges that we face. So what the Global South is talking about is climate change, poverty alleviation, the Sustainable Development Goals, essentially also what China's global initiatives also talk about. Of course, there are some issues. I mean, we know that even between China and India, there are bilateral challenges. So many more regions in the world. But what we do not want is to go back to an era where the powerful decide what is right and what is wrong. We all collectively agree on the principles of the Bandung movement. We collectively agree that the UN Charter must be upheld. We collectively agree that we did not fight colonialism to be now, in the shackles of hegemonism. And this is something that I think is a broader consensus, and it's going to shape how any powerful country in the world needs to position itself. I'll also mention here, whether it's China, the United States, EU, any significant pole, we're talking about a multipolar world, and we know that the two most powerful countries right now are obviously the United States and China. The relevance and long-term, leadership, acceptance of their leadership depends on the extent to which they can deliver what the world really needs. And in that sense, the United States is doing absolutely nothing. They are withdrawing from the climate change consensus.
So you're mentioning a very important question,
Yeah.
and a lot of people are saying, look, the United States, it seems that they have abandoned this role as a leader for the world. They say, we don't care whether we're a leader, we just care that we make ourselves great again. But what about on the part of China? China is not there yet, it's my impression, and it doesn't prominently position itself in that kind of leadership position, although it is slowly formulating what kind of vision it has for the world. But China is not there yet. So what's going to happen in terms of this issue?
I think what the biggest challenge that we have faced in also the field of international relations is that it has been very hard for people to conceive a power, for example, a rising China, that does not position itself as colonialist did or a hegemonic power did. And what China is currently doing, at least this is my view, that when China announced the Belt and Road Initiative, they understood that this is something they can deliver to the world at large. Infrastructure gaps. Then the Development Initiative was Sustainable Development Goals. Then their vision for civilizational dialogue, acceptance. No one ideology or culture is superior or has the ability to, dominate others. We should coexist. Then the Security Initiative as well, which is, again, in line with what the Global South wants, real long-term solutions, address the root causes. And then the Global Governance Initiative, because this is the deficit. So I think what China is really doing is showcasing to the world what their vision is, and then through multilateral fora, through the BRI, through bilateral, through FOCAC, China Central Asia, through so many other mechanisms, showcasing what they can practically deliver to the world. Leadership is not about domination. It's not about telling others or dictating others. It's actually about being, a power that can deliver positive results, mutual benefit, mutual gain, win-win cooperation.
I see. I get your point.
And I think that's the big difference.
I see.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think you touched upon a very important, what exactly is leadership? Is what China going to provide as a major power going to be this, in the same light of what the United States has been projecting or providing to the globe since the end of Second World War? Joseph, what is your take? And that's almost the end of the story. So I give the last question to you, Joseph.
Yeah, I agree substantially with Zoon. I think when we look at the models, we look at the US model and we understand what its shortcomings are. I think if we look at the European model, most Europeans today would tell you that on the one hand, the European model embodies sort of a democratic principle, but at the same time, it hasn't been able to really effectively organize itself and to bring together a true solidarity in Europe so that it could resist the United States, even though the EU and the Euro were designed in part to be able to push back against U.S. Hegemony. It is the case that China is seeking a different model. I do agree with Professor Wong that China is playing a leading role, but taking a soft touch, leading from the center, not from the front, not from the back, but trying to establish a new ethos, a new paradigm based on old principles, five principles of peaceful coexistence, these sorts of things, but really realizing that the only way to move forward is not to repeat the mistakes of the past. This is what the rest of the world is struggling with right now, above all because one of those big mistakes is still being made.
Well, very interesting and important discussions. I found it totally fascinating. Again, 30 minutes is too short, but I hope that we have provided some clarity, some iotas of clarity. Many thanks to my guest, Professor Huang Jing, University Professor at Shanghai International Studies University, Zoon Ahmed Khan, Pakistani researcher and journalist at the Center for China and Globalization, and Professor Joseph Mahoney from East China Normal University. Thank you so much for sharing your important insights. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.